afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Phyllis Lockett. I'm the CEO of Leap Innovations. And if you are meaning to be at Resolved, personalized learning is often neither personalized nor learning. You're in the right place. So we're going to get started because we had a tough time kind of getting in the room. I hope our session is as good. I'm so excited to have with me on this panel Larry Berger, CEO of Amplify, Joel Rose, co-founder and CEO of New Classroom on the far end, Phil Regier from University Dean and Educational Initiatives and CEO of EdPlus at ASU, and Nick Gaehde, who is the president of Lexia Learning. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to dive right in, and really this panel was inspired by this increasing debate of what personalized learning is and what it's not. And Larry, you kind of kicked this off, quite frankly, because, well, first of all, you're one of the trailblazers in ed tech. We all respect and adore you. But when you started Amplify, you had this engineering mindset around the potential promise of personalized learning, which Rick Hess apparently reprinted, and it's just set off a firestorm, so that's why we're here. So describe this premise that kind of drove your perspective on personalized learning.
Yeah, so the admired and respected until I wrote this little two-part essay, and Rick published the first part of it in his blog. And I didn't know people read that blog, and so I made an argument which I think I am comfortable standing behind, and I'm happy to talk about it, which is sort of a case against a certain way of thinking about personalized learning, but I think it's also, I hope, a window into some other ways of thinking about it. So the point that I made was that there's a thing that I called the engineering version of personalized learning, and it's the idea that you could build a map of the things that kids need to know. You could measure a given kid, how they're doing on that, and place them on the map, and then you could go into a library of learning objects and select the right learning object for that kid, and they would learn it, then you could measure again and move them along the map, and in that way they could master domains. And I think that set of metaphors is pretty potent in the way that people talk about personalized learning. And the argument that I made, and it has an important caveat that I want to put out there, which is I think in early learning and in early reading and in the quantitative aspects, number and operation in mathematics, we sort of have the map. But the point I made is for almost everything else, we don't actually have a measure that places anyone with any precision in a domain that doesn't take a kind of too much time to administer. We don't actually have the map. Like, we don't know whether you should teach genes and then proteins and then traits, or traits and then proteins and then genes. There's not like a right order that happens developmentally. And even if we had those two, just because, I would also say, we don't have a very good library of independent learning objects that just meet a kid right where they need to be. And even if we did, it's not clear that a kid wants to do the thing that the algorithm has chosen for them, even if the algorithm thinks it's optimal. And so the point is, it's a pretty good system, a measure, a map, a library, except we don't have the measure, we don't have the map, we don't have the library, and yet there's a lot of believing in it going on out there. Again, the caveat, I think in early reading, there's been enough basic research that we have a good sense of the map, but it becomes completely abstract at the moment that reading comprehension kicks in. Like, no one has the developmental model of that. And in mathematics, I think we have it around number and operation in the early grades. And then when it gets to complex mathematical reasoning, and then certainly in like subject matter domains like social studies and science, there's very little in the way of developmental sequence. So that's the provocative argument. I'll stop there and saying what it is. But I do think there are lots of other ways of looking at personalization that I hope we'll get to.
We will get to it, and I'm going to try very hard to stay moderator and not panelist. So again, the fundamental premise here is that you need these algorithms and these maps in order to personalize learning. I'd love to hear from some of our other panelists who spent a lot of time thinking about this. So Joel, jump in.
So then Rick was kind enough to write my response to Larry's piece, which we were largely, I think, in agreement with on both sides. So I take Larry's point that there's a lot that we don't know in the engineering model of personalized learning. But for us, that doesn't mean you don't do personalized learning. It means you maybe have to narrow the scope of what it is that we're trying to engineer. So the way we think about it is it's not about a product that you sort of graft on top of the same one teacher, 30 kids in a box delivery model and say, now you're doing personalized learning. You've got to kind of reimagine the whole classroom itself. And so spending as much time on things like content and assessment and progressions as, what if there's a substitute teacher one day? Where do kids put their backpacks? Room acoustics, how does homework work? And it's through engineering the entire classroom experience in ways that gives teachers lots of flexibilities in terms of what can happen. It's that kind of R&D across all domains that we think is going to sort of unlock a new generation of successful personalization.
This is the kind of fierce debate that they have to put two people between us, or else the whole Maury Povich thing could happen.
I'm just glad that Joel brought up teachers and classrooms. That was nice to hear that in the context of personalized learning. But Nick, please.
Yeah, so I think often we think about personalized learning and we think about the engineering model as something that is technology-driven and technology only. And I think that's often the problem with some of the personalized learning solutions that are put in place. It's not just about personalized learning for the student, it's also personalizing learning for the educator, giving them the right data about the student at the right time and the right instructional sequences to address the strengths and weaknesses of that student. I agree with Larry about the foundational literacy and the map that we have. I think there's been a lot of research done, and we understand the scope and sequence and the skills that have to be introduced before another skill can be mastered. I think when you get to the higher order skills, there isn't a map, but there is a sequence of strategies that we know leads to greater proficiency. And that's, again, where I think personalization and personalization for the educator can make a big difference.
Phil. Well,
Yeah, so I wish I had something incredibly intelligent to add at this point, but what I'd say is a couple of things. First off, I expect the four of us are in complete agreement, and the idea that there is not an algorithm or an adaptive engine or a set of personalized learning technologies that is a silver bullet, that you're going to stick a kid in front of a computer and have them learn math or physics or anything else. That has to occur inside a learning and teaching ecosystem, which involves faculty. In the case of higher education, it involves faculty and professors, and they're incredibly important to the process. Beyond that, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, that's great. All right. You know, I was admiring actually a couple of the blog responses to your statement, Larry, and I'll share this one. To think the problem of education can be solved through collecting enough data and applying algorithms that will pick out the right sequence of computerized lessons to apply to each human being is dumb. Human beings aren't made of little microprocessors. They have families and teachers and friends and learn through a process of social interaction that cannot be fully mimicked by computers. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I think in some sense that's, they got right to the point with dumb. I used other adjectives and you know, I should say in all of this, it's not like, you know, part of why I think this stirred up some controversy is I think I have been for a lot of my career someone who felt we just have to finish the map and make the measures good enough and build a big enough library, and it was only a few years ago that I started to feel like something's not right about what we're trying to get done there. You know, I would say that the sort of description of the kids are not microprocessors, when I tried to think about, so what's the reason why this engineering model of personalization has such hold, even in places where people would say, of course it's more complicated than that, and then somehow you look at the product in some cases and it's like, actually that looks like you're thinking that way. And the thing that occurred to me is many of us here in search of what are the things that technology can do to be really helpful in a classroom. And one of the very attractive things is the idea that the network diagram of a classroom is a really bad system because you've got 30 parallel processing kids out there. They each can think about different things at different levels. And you've got one transmitter that is not parallel processing capable. Although teachers can do a little bit of it, they can't do 30 parallel processes. So the engineer says, great, this is a thing we can fix, because we can replace that one transmitter with a range of parallel processing experiences that can solve that network diagram and make it rational. So that's attractive at just a structural level. The computer can multitask, the kids need multitasking, let's put it there. Then the other thing is that there's a pedagogical and personal thing that comes along to support that view, which is there's a lot of good education research that says one-on-one tutoring is kind of the best thing we have if we want to make a big gain for a kid. And so if you can provide it, there's not a lot that there's nothing really that's outperformed that as a head-to-head teaching model. And we all have personal experiences of like that great learning experiences we had when someone took a personal interest in it. So you put those two together, a kind of engineering thing that makes sense. The computer could get too close to a one-to-one teaching model, and one-to-one feels right. It's like our best experiences are sort of like that. Except when I ask around, anybody had a really great experience in every person on their own learning journey computer program, and nobody jumps out with one of those that is their great learning experience. And I think that the thing that's missing in that, again, it's sort of obvious, but it took me a while to find it, and so I'll say it, is what's going on in that one-on-one experience is not simply the matching of teaching and level. It's an adult that kid wants to impress and wants to understand, and that adult that's understanding that kid. And so the engineering diagram looks a lot better, but something can get lost in that shuffle.
Thank you for acknowledging that.
We're supposed to disagree a little bit here. So the one area that I'll disagree is that I think sometimes the technology and personalization of the curriculum allows the student to do things that they would never do without it. It allows them to take some risks, and as we all know, especially when you're getting into upper elementary school and middle school, the number one job is don't get embarrassed. So without technology and that one-to-one interaction with the curriculum, students aren't going to take the risks that they will in a private environment that technology allows for them. Yeah.
But the balance is very real, that it is a combination of both, of what I'm hearing as evolving of Larry's statements, which is we're getting on the right path. So Joel, please,
right,
you're doing a lot of this with Teach to One. Can you talk a little about it?
So the fact that there are limitations to what can happen in the kind of environment Larry's talking about is real. But let's also remember what the counterfactual is, which is one teacher, 30 kids, 800 square foot room with a textbook. And so the question is, even if we don't have like stuck the landing on all the elements of personalization, does anyone think that doing that is the very best way for every kid every day by any teacher? And if we think that there have to be better ways in the 21st century to organize the whole classroom, integrating the best of what teachers can do and the best of what technology can do in an integrated, seamless way, then that's the kind of engineering that we should be doing.
Can you talk about how Teach to One's doing it?
Sure. So the way Teach to One works in 38 schools around the country, if you have reading first, let's say you're a 7th grader, and you have reading first period in room 206, you have PE second period in the gym, third period it's math time. And instead of walking into room 105, you walk into a big open space with lots of different stations. In some stations, kids work with teachers. In some stations, kids work with software. In some stations, kids work with each other in different kinds of activities. And there's a sign above each station. This is Howard University. This is Spelman University. This is Yale University, whatever the case may be. When you walk in for math, you look up and you see these big TV monitors that look like what you see at the airport. And you see your name and you see which station you're supposed to go to. So you might spend the first 30 minutes working on area of a triangle with a teacher and 14 other kids at Spelman. Then you move to Howard University, where you spend the next 30 minutes working on that same skill in a peer-to-peer activity. Then the last 10 minutes, you take an online assessment in that skill, and then you're off to social studies. We then take the data from that assessment and create a new schedule for you for the next day based on how you did the previous day.
Thank you.
Can I intervene here?
Yes, please.
So clearly I'm like the outlier here because in higher education, we have incredibly different environments. Right? We aren't dealing with 30 students.
So much easier.
It is so much easier because to some extent, I don't have to worry about the engagement of the student and creating an optimal learning experience. What I have to look at is, are students more successful, and are they learning at in higher order thinking than they were previously? And we have, using personalized and adaptive learning tools, we have 30,000 seat enrollments at the freshman year at ASU, where the course success rates are moving from 75% to 90% plus. And we're succeeding with precisely the type of students that universities have to succeed with if we want to move to a model where a kid's zip code is not the best predictor of whether they're going to graduate or not. And so from my standpoint, these personalized learning tools, if put in an appropriate environment, teaching learning environment, ecosystem with faculty, we can scale those. I can teach 100 students at a time instead of 30 or 40 at a time, with much higher success rates, much better student outcomes, much better engagement, much lower withdrawal rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is an easier environment to work in. This 30 students at a time in every classroom is different. That just makes it incredibly, incredibly difficult to scale and achieve the type of outcomes that you want.
Thank you.
So that might be the last thing I say.
It was good, though.
It was good, and you guys can talk K-12 now.
No, I was going to say, though, no, but back to the point around, you keep talking about it as an ecosystem, that it's not just an engineering construct, but that the notion is that you need both. Is that what you're asserting?
Absolutely, you have to have both. You do have to have a certain engineering mentality in the sense that, believe it or not, all faculty have to teach off the same syllabus. All faculty have to use the same assessments. If you can't do that, you can't improve, okay? But beyond that, what we do is all in these 8 or 10 killer classes at the freshman level at ASU, all of the content is delivered adaptively or in a personalized manner, and all that means to us, and we use 6 or 8 different tools, different companies from McGraw-Hill, Smart Sparrow, Pearson, we used to use Newton, et cetera, a whole set of, cog books, et cetera, a whole set of different tools. But the content is delivered adaptively. The student only comes to class once a week because they get the content adaptively before they come. And then they go into a classroom that is an active learning classroom. The faculty benefit tremendously because they have a dashboard that tells where the students are. They can divide the students into small groups, and they can begin working on either remediation, but more importantly, the student is probably prepared. What they're going to work on is higher order thinking skills, not just content delivery. That's done by the adaptive system.
That's great. Nick, can you talk a little bit about Lexia and your approach around personalized learning?
Sure. So we're now, we talk about not being able to do this at scale. I would argue that we are now doing this at scale. We're working in 12,000 schools across the country. Last year, about 3.5 million students. Every day now, about 1 million students are logging on, and I see some of the educational leaders in the room are helping make that happen. And those students are benefiting from that very personalized path through the reading curriculum. I think we're also learning from higher ed and from what's actually happening in the field that it's not just contained in the classroom. Personalized learning is embracing the educator and making sure the educator understands the individual needs of students, but also pushing out into the home, giving parents, giving the people who are working with students outside of the school day knowledge about what those students need and how to support them. I think the critical part, and we've talked about this, is it's not just technology. It's giving educators and everyone who's working with those students the information they need to make instructional decisions, to support those students, and then guiding them to instructional resources to continue the learning process and making that as efficient and time effective as possible. I've seen a lot of things in K-12 go wrong because we ask more of teachers. I think the promise of personalized learning is actually making teachers and educators' lives earlier so that they can meet students where they are.
I think that's great. Yes.
Can I make the case for 30 kids in a room with a textbook, just briefly? Because I think I mean, I think what Nick is doing, like if a kid is working on basic phonemic awareness, the fluency lesson is not the thing that they need. And so he's solving a real problem, and it's key to solve that. Similarly, if a kid is doing advanced algebra and there's another kid who has to do fractions, the notion that we would pick the lesson at the median between the two feels like a big mistake. But in a lot of cases, the interesting project is how do you get all of the kids doing a thing. And sometimes I think some of the excesses of personalized learning are when there was a good way of doing that and we decided to try to fix it. So a good example would be I once looked at a school that was using a product that would generate texts that are at the appropriate level for kids and pick them based on their reading level. And the problem was that some of the kids in the class were reading the Declaration of Independence. That was the activity. And so I was like, okay, so I get that choice. What are the other kids doing? And it was like, well, they're not ready. They're reading something called My Corner Store. And I was like, something is wrong in that choice, because part of the democratic project is we all get together and try to understand what these foundational texts are about. And you can approach the Declaration at lots of stages of your education and get different things out of it. So the project in that Declaration lesson is, how do you get lots of kids to be able to access the same text in a communal experience? And that's something that teachers have figured out lots of good ways of doing that are also personalized learning that technology could help them with. The interesting thing is not to just have a bunch of kids not read that, or worse yet, to say, you're going to read the version of it that talks about life, liberty, and being happy, because the pursuit of happiness is a complicated formulation. And so the thing is, what teachers have always done is, how do I scaffold a set of kids, give them the background knowledge they need to participate? How do I give different kinds of feedback on the work that kids do on that shared experience? How do I pair kids up in ways that might help them be successful in activities? Those are all different kinds of personalized learning, but they don't start with the premise that we should change the activity for each of the kids in the classroom as the first act of personalization. And I think part of where the second part of my...
Who's asserting that? Who's asserting that, Larry? Who is asserting that?
I think some of the most widely used products in education that claim to do personalization change the text for different kids at different levels. Like that is, I don't want to name names.
I'm trying really hard to keep my moderator hat on. Joel, please help me. Help me.
On you, Phyllis. Well, I would just say, I think this ultimately goes to, today, most personalized experiences are basically choreographed by the teacher. The teacher's got to be the designer of how all these things get integrated. And so one popular model is a rotational model. Kids spend some time with the computer, spend some time with the teacher, rotate around. That gives kids a personalized experience, but not a synchronized experience, because you go up to a kid, you say, what are you working on online? I'm working on X. What are you in your regular class? We're working on Y. They're two different experiences. Other teachers might say, okay, we're going to do the flipped classroom. Kids are going to go home, they're going to watch the Khan video, they're going to come back, and we're going to do an activity on what they did. That's great. It's wonderfully synchronized, but it's not personalized. Everyone is doing that same activity. And so what I think the point you're making isn't that we shouldn't personalize learning. It's that we have to redesign the classroom experience in ways that leverage the best of what both can do.
But okay, thank you for that. But just because students are engaging in different content, to suggest that's not personalizing learning seems off. Seems really off to me. Kids participating in the same context and having the experience that you're talking about is absolutely personalized learning. Mm-hmm. It is about how every student, where you're meeting them where they are, and how they're engaging in the process. You're not reducing the rigor. You're keeping them on on an arc. Yeah. But you know, this is the conflating of this issue is where I think we get a lot of challenges in this space and in our sector around what exactly we're talking about. Nick or Phil, come on, help me out.
No. I mean, it's a lot more complicated. Really, with 30 students in the classroom, with different teachers running adaptive systems, it is a lot more complicated. And you know, I have a very simple idea of a personalization, which is the right content for the right student at the right time. Now, at a university level course, that all has to aggregate to a set of learning outcomes that we all agree on.
We're not going to change.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm not sure that's true at the elementary school level or K-12.
Yeah, Nick, what do you?
I think part of what we're doing is making time for the kind of personalization that Larry is talking about. It's not necessarily, again, personalization through the products we're talking about, but personalization because teachers have more time, have more knowledge about the students to then engage in the higher level skills and the higher level dialogue that they need. We're removing the things that technology can do and giving teachers back the time so that they can engage in a much more meaningful and richer way.
I think some of the misnomers, and I was talking to Giselle about this on the way over here, is around personalized learning, is that it's about kids in front of a computer. And I've heard that a lot on this panel, kids in front of a computer. No, that's not just it. It's got to be run by algorithms, and that you don't need technology. It's all of these things, right? And so, you know, I think that the notion that we need technology, yes, we need the algorithms to give data to educators so they can discern how to personalize for every single student. And you do need technology, but that doesn't mean that kids are siphoned off somewhere and some kids are doing one thing and another kids have to be doing something else in order for it to be personalized. So can we kind of come to terms with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're talking about tailoring the experience, tailoring what kids are learning and tailoring how they're learning it. Now, when you tailor what they're learning, you might find 14 other kids who happen to need that particular concept at a particular point in time. And in the way you teach them, it may be through collaborative activities or projects or whole group instruction. It's just not the same what and the same how for every kid every day.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yay. Can we give a round of applause for that one? I know. Thank you for that. So, hold on for a second. Now my sister's trying to FaceTime me. Stop it. I know. Oh my God, family.
Did she agree with Joel?
I think she did. She was calling in to say yes.
Because I need some backup here.
But no, so talk to me about, in this context, right? What's the role of the teacher in this, and what is the role of the student? Because I'm also not hearing enough about the student role. Personalized learning is really learner-centered, right, education. So what is the role of the student? And Phil, you can weigh on this as well.
Oh,
At the higher ed level.
I think the role of the teacher, at least at the university level, is a little bit more straightforward. You have to transform the role of the teacher from basically somebody who's providing content to somebody who is assisting a student master concepts. And that means that the faculty member has to adapt to the technology, and the faculty member has to work with the technology and understand it. Having said that, generally, you know, the light goes off in the minds of faculty as soon as they see an intelligent dashboard that tells where their students are, who's struggling, who's not struggling, who's working, who's not working, where they are in the different concepts, which is almost only available with a sophisticated and intelligent adaptive system. Just a couple of small points. An adaptive system does not have to be algorithmically generated. It can be generated through large data. It can be intelligent branching, et cetera, et cetera. The ones that are algorithmically generated, you'd better keep them up to date, and they have the possibility of going out of date very quickly. But what the and by the way, an intelligent, fantastic teacher to 30 students perhaps does not need technology. But that's not the challenge we have in the country in higher education. The challenge we have in the country is how to teach more and more students with declining resources. And for that, the technology underlying the adaptive systems is absolutely critical. Yeah. You can't scale without that technology.
I remember when I was a teacher, my very first day, and the principal knocked on my door. He said, Mr. Rose, here's a stack of papers of all the, of last year's test scores. You'll see that I taught 5th grade. I had some on a 3rd grade level, some on an 8th grade level, and everything in between. I said, okay, got it, thanks. 5 minutes later, he knocked on my door again. Mr. Rose, here are your textbooks. Good luck. And I said, well, how exactly am I supposed to? I'll just do your best. That's kind of what we all do. It is an almost impossible job that we ask of teachers today, to meet the needs of each and every one of their students every single day. And so we've got to find ways while we reimagine the classroom, one, to make the job more sustainable for them.
Yeah, I think we're there. I think we got there. I'm asking in this new context, what is the role of the teacher? in this
To
new
teach.
context.
To teach.
But again,
I mean, I don't mean to be flip, but at least in our model, there are 17 kids coming to see Mr. Jones to learn factoring trinomials tomorrow. He's going to teach factoring trinomials. He's going to teach. And then he's going to look at the data, and he's going to see who got it, who didn't. And when he does it again 2 weeks later, he's going to make those changes and teach another 16 kids. And then 4 weeks later, another 12 kids.
Nick, how are you seeing the role of the teacher evolving in this new context?
So I agree with the statement that the role of the teacher, and I think when we see technology implemented well in the classroom, we see it happening, is to teach, and it's to spend less time administering tests. It's the less time analyzing data. It's less time curating content. It's having those things done for them in a way that gives them the space, the time to teach, and to know the students both because of the data they have about the students, but to know the students because they have the time to know them on a more personal basis. So I think about it often as going back to some of the things that worked in the one-room schoolhouse.
But isn't, again,
I know what and.
thank you.
And, I think I know where you're going.
I'm trying to keep my
The
moderator
job
on.
of the teacher is to shift the ownership to the student.
Thank
to have
you.
the student, I
Ding,
know.
ding, 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 ding.
That, in the traditional model, teacher teaches, kids learn. It's a very passive activity. The most successful teachers with personalized learning find ways to inspire their kids to take more ownership over their own learning because they have more tools to be able to do that.
And I see it happening in classrooms all the time now. I get the benefit of going into classrooms and seeing students working with the programs. And every single time I go in, a student, a second grader or a third grader will pull me over and say, look what I'm learning right now. And there's an excitement and an engagement and an understanding about what they're learning. Not just that they scored into the next level and I'm making progress, but hey, I'm working on initial consonant blends, and isn't this cool? That's a second or third grader talking about that. That's amazing.
Student ownership. I love it.
So-
Phil, before you get in, go ahead. Phil, please.
Oh, I was just going to make an observation. Again, this is disjunction between the way it works in K-12 and higher ed. But like in higher ed, I might be standing up in front of a classroom just like this room, and delivering content to a group of people like this. And there's nothing personalized about that. I am treating every one of you, it's a factory model of education, right? And this way, what reminded me is like, oh, I've got kids at the 5th grade level and kids at the 8th grade level. Here's the textbook, right? I stand in front of this room and everybody has different levels of knowledge and understanding, but I'm going to treat all of you exactly the same. The technology actually gives us the ability to personalize learning for a group of people at least this large in the way that the classroom model of faculty instruction lecturing in front of a group of students this large never did. Personalized learning has to rely on technology. Otherwise, I have a factory model of a sage on the stage, which is not as effective.
And
Just an observation.
And I agree with that statement. But I also harken back to the ecosystem of change that has to come with that in terms of what the role of the teacher is and what that looks like and how that shifts, as well as the shift of the student to be a much more empowered student that has ownership, as Nick was describing. I mean, very similar to what your college students are doing is our goal of what we want our K-12 students to be able to do. All right, Larry, go ahead. Go ahead, shoot it down.
So, I mean, I should confess that I'm in fierce agreement with a lot of this, and we build in early literacy and in math a bunch of personalized learning tools, and we want kids to take ownership and master things at their own level. But I worry that sometimes the view is, and the extension of that as to even more of that happening, even more meeting them where they are, even more of their sort of autonomous owning of an individual learning path actually doesn't resonate with another view of some of our best learning experiences. And to some extent, like we often go to math or early literacy as the example of like, isn't it foolish to put these, but that sage on the stage, if the text in front of us is a poem and the question is, why is it a midnight dreary instead of a dreary midnight? And the class kind of leans forward to say, actually, I don't know. And a whole room of people doesn't really know. And then somebody unexpected has an idea and someone else bounces off that idea. Like that's the other great thing in education And I don't think anyone up here is making a case against that, but it's just, are we using these personalization tools to get some mastery so that we can do more personalization and more mastery? Or are we doing it so that we can come together in shared learning experiences that might look quite traditional? And I have sometimes seen this teacher who's lighting a fire around that poem each day is doing a traditional kind of sage on the stage teaching. And this teacher who's got a bunch of software running, they're doing personalized learning. And I get that I've chosen my examples in unfair ways, but I am worried that sometimes the energy around personalized learning causes one of those teachers to be doing the wrong thing and the other one to be doing the right thing. And I actually think it's about getting the blend right, which is why I ended up in fierce agreement with Joel on the model really matters. Like, when are we doing that group teaching experience? And do we have a school that lets us move from one kind to another?
And are they mutually exclusive? Because I think
Yeah,
that's the sense that I'm getting from you, that, and it is not. I mean, we're working with over 100 schools in Chicago. The construct of what we're calling personalized learning has everything you're describing, and so does Joel's. I mean, your construct is not all kids on computers doing their own thing.
No.
So, I mean, again, you've got group. Can you talk about your rotations and the experience
Sure,
that blends both of what Joel's discussing?
There's teacher-delivered modalities. There's 3 of those. There's 2 collaborative modalities, and there's 3 independent modalities. But I think maybe one way to sort of reconcile, Larry, your point has to do with how accessible that lesson is. So it's fine to have an inspiring lesson about a wonderful poem so long as all the students in the class can access that and can meaningfully participate in that conversation. But if it is 5 grade levels above, like where they are, and they're just feeling like a failure and it's a waste of precious instructional time, then I argue it's not necessarily a great experience. So when many of us have had those experiences, it could be that we've been in classes where everyone was able to access that material.
So I'm going to do a personalized learning thing, which is like, Phyllis, you know so much about this. Phyllis, how does it work in LEAP?
Oh, Larry.
The right teacher for the right moment.
The right teacher for the right. You gonna let me be a panelist? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So LEAP, and I'm gonna have you, if after this, you're gonna download our framework, the LEAP Learning Framework, and read it. Okay. About what we're saying personalized learning is. Okay.
Yeah.
That it's learner-centered. Let's start with that. Starts with the learner. It's learner focus. Every student has their own personalized learning pathway.
Yeah.
Educators are meeting students where they are. That learning is demonstrated, meaning when they show mastery, they advance.
Yeah.
That learner, there's agency, okay? And that every student has the empowered to navigate and direct their learning, but it's also connected in ways that enable the connection of outside learning and inside learning to happen in accredited ways, where you're balancing the full experience of the learning experience. The educator is a core part of that, right? And we don't think you can really personalize learning without educators. We also agree that you do need technology in order to scale this in a way, but the educator role is shifting, which we think is extraordinary in the ways that Nick was describing. So, you know, but the sense of there is this one-size-fits-all. I mean, the psychology that, well, if you know, there's still a teacher teaching to a bunch of kids and they're all on the same, you know, learning about the same content, that's not personalized learning. I don't know if that is true, because we need kids to traverse all kinds of learning modalities to fully realize their potential and their experience. If that is the only singular delivery, then that is absolutely not personalized learning. Yeah. So I do think that there's an important blend around how this is happening and how it needs to work.
Yeah.
The other thing I think from the LEAP model that we've learned is that you don't drop personalized learning programs and methodologies into the classroom and walk away and have magic happen, right?
Right.
It requires a level of support and education on an ongoing basis to make it actually as powerful as it can be. But when that happens, you see extraordinary results.
Yes, and we are seeing extraordinary results from that construct, but it is not it's solely anchored on this algorithmic or engineering approach. And you know, I think the general point around it is there are some gaps, right? And we fully recognize there's still some gaps, because this is a very emerging space. And albeit there's been an extraordinary amount of investment. You know, I think one of the questions I have for you is most of you are spending a lot of time thinking about this and developing solutions is how do we catalyze and direct the investment to really get to the level that we need to for kids in personalized learning?
Another way to ask that question is, why has personalized learning not made much greater inroads than it has up to this point? Although,
Yeah.
if you're a believer in it. And in higher
Right.
education, I'd argue that the reason it hasn't made much greater inroads is because of an interesting type of market failure. And the market failure is sellers have information that the buyers don't have, and the buyers do not have the ability to ever gain that information from the sellers. And so it's essentially a used car market. And that market is going to fail as long as there's important information asymmetry between the buyers and the sellers. And I think a way to break that down is to becoming more transparent around how the actual, whether it's algorithmically generated, whether it's intelligent branching, whether it's big data, et cetera, and then to actually have efficacy data, which is almost never provided except in classrooms of 18 students, 32 students, 64 students, carefully cherry-picked by the companies who are selling this stuff. And so I think, like, if I'm a university administrator, I throw my hands up too and say, I don't know how to pick among these things. Just an observation again.
Thank you for that. It's one of the reasons why LEAP exists. Thank you.
I mean, I would say in K-12, there has been a profound lack of investment in R&D. And if you take sort of a model view of the world, it is much more expensive and challenging to totally redesign the classroom experience than to code up an app. And so you've got much higher upfront R&D costs into a market that in the US has 15,000 fairly fragmented districts that don't make it easy to recoup that investment. And all of us know a number of venture capitalists who want nothing to do with K-12 because of it. And so because those investors want to have low upfront R&D and quick ramp up. And so we're kind of stuck in the mud of an ecosystem that really can't generate the kind of revenue that's truly, truly required to design these transformational experiences. And so we're stuck with these sort of products that teachers are trying to graft onto one another and make sense of.
Nick, any? Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I mean, I guess maybe another way of making the point would be, I think we have done an awful lot of investing in the kinds of personalization that computers are good at. And the argument I'm making is to invest in the kinds of personalization that teachers are good at and giving them tools to be more successful at that. And if you do that, we might have less of the market failure because teachers would say, okay, I get what that computer's trying to do. That's a thing I do, and it would be nice to have some help. Instead of, that computer does a thing that I don't do, and I'm okay with it babysitting some of my kids while I do the thing I do, but I'm not quite ready to let it take over what I'm about.
But that's what I would argue has changed in the last 5 to 10 years. I can't remember the last time I walked into a classroom, whether it was 2nd or 3rd or 4th grade, and saw a row of desks with a teacher's desk at the front. I just don't see it anymore. And I think there's often hesitation that it's going to be chaos, and what you see instead is much more engagement. And I agree with Larry, it's not just the technology, it's what the technology enables to happen in the classroom with the teacher.
And also one small point on this, which is most educational technology products today are used as supplemental tools for the teachers to use or not use as they see fit. And as a result, it's nearly impossible to tease out efficacy. And so then as a result, making the case that this is the thing that the school's got to have, the district's got to have, is really, really hard because it has not completely transformed the whole experience.
But I think efficacy is something we know now. And it's happening with LEAP and it's happening in other places. Treatment and control, randomized samples, pre-test, post-test, published research about the efficacy of these programs. I think the problem that we talked about was that research is not getting into the hands of the decision makers. And sometimes the decision makers are not the teachers and not the school administrators. It's happening at too high of a level. And it's not happening in a way that gives access to the people who actually need it.
So this sounds like systemic or structural problems, not so much as an investment problem. Is that
I mean, I think the structural problems limit the investment where the investment can have the
flow,
greatest
right.
impact, yeah.
Yeah. You agree with that? Yeah. Okay. So assuming we can get past that, and again, that's part of what our model is trying to do anyway, is again, putting the principals and educators in the driver's seat to redesign their classrooms, to make really informed, get exposure to various approaches to personalized learning, redesign their models, and then bring in the tech that's going to help augment that, right? And then they learn about it, and we get the data, and then they can, we're enabling what we're hoping is smarter decision making around this. Assuming we can create that and scale it, right? And we can get to some realization. What's it going to look like? Like, what do you see education looking like in the next, say, 10 years or 20 years even, if this can be achievable?
I would gently push back against the assumption in there that I think once we're saying, okay, teacher, design your own classroom, I think we're limited to what can possibly happen. There was only so much design I could possibly do, much less use technology in any real way, that ultimately to truly transform the classroom experience requires serious R&D. Teachers can have should be part of the process and should have optionality within that. But I think if we're creating 3.5 million teachers who are going to redesign their own classroom experience, I think they're going to look a lot like the ones we have today.
So
Yeah, you please. I was going to suggest you guys go ahead, because I'm once again orthogonal.
I would just say that that it's possible that at least in 10 years, things will look a lot like they do now, but better. Like, I'm a genuine optimist about this, but I think about the fact that, like, Lexia got awesome towards the last few years of a 25-year run. Like, I mean, that's the right time frame, right? Like
34 years.
34 years. Okay, and like, that's not the time frame that any of today's venture capitalists are hoping these things will pop in. I think that Teach to One is getting awesome after 10 years? 8, okay. Those first few felt like more than. And I think of, like, for the last few years, we've been working on an adaptive thing that only does fractions. And, like, we thought we'd have it done in 2 years, and I think we got another 2 to go. So it's just to say the time frame of getting this stuff right, of fleshing out a little bit more of the map, of understanding what are the behavioral things that have to surround it, what are the models that need to be there, are such that I'm super optimistic. Like, I love the game of these slow improvements, but I'm not sure I see, like, a tipping point where suddenly everything is awesome.
But I think the reason it took so long to get awesome is also because it took so long for the market and for schools to embrace these kinds of products.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's now happening, and I think we're going to see an acceleration of personalization and of better performance.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that, Nick, because part of the challenge I know that we've seen is the development is happening so far away from the needs of our educators and students, and then we wonder why adoption is so slow.
Yeah.
So given that, and that's what we're starting to see as a real tipping point in the numbers of schools and educators that we've had the opportunity to work with in Chicago, that the demand is catching up.
Yeah.
And so hopefully with that will be a way to drive this to some level of
But shouldn't
positivity.
LEAP be national, like, not just in Chicago? I'm just saying, funders in the room.
I did not ask him to say that. Did not ask him to say that. We're working on it, Larry.
Okay.
We're working on it. But I think, and I know we're going to have to wrap up, but I do think that the other piece that I just, again, want to leave with is because I think we are in some agreement, right, in the construct of this conversation. And, first and foremost, that this has to be about the learner. It's got to be learner-centered. And if we're going to get there, we can't get there without technology and the human aspect of educator in more of a facilitative role, enabling the learner to realize their full potential. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.